The idea that the Russian Federation could break apart has been on my mind a lot since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. During the 20th century, Russia lost substantial portions of its territory twice, both times following a crisis. After the Russian Revolution of 1917 and following the end of the Cold War in 1991. But even though a third Russian disintegration, and yes, it's happened enough times there's actually an academic term for this, even though it seemed possible, how exactly Russia might split apart again has always seemed kind of fuzzy to me. Because in lots of really important ways, the situation in 2025 is very different from the situations in 1991 and 1917. I don't think it's possible to say exactly how or exactly when or even if a third Russian disintegration would definitely happen, but one way in which I've been thinking about it happening has become a lot clearer to me in the last month. And it's also become a lot more clear to me that a third Russian disintegration becomes a lot more likely the longer Vladimir Putin stays in power. I'll explain everything. Stay tuned. Hi everyone, my name's Fredo Rockwell, and in my last video I discussed the twin crises which are unfolding in Transnistria and Abkhazia, and how this is showing a weakness that is becoming more evident in the Russian Federation. I'm hoping to make a follow-up to that video soon, specifically about the Abkhazian presidential election happening in February. But in the meantime, I wanted to share with you one of my theories about something which soon might be driving even more weakness in the Russian Federation. The theory hinges on an idea which I'm going to call mercenary federalism. This is not a totally original idea, but I've sort of made up this term to capture exactly what it is that I'm talking about. And when I say mercenary federalism, I mean mercenary is in the sense of out for your own personal selfish gain, not as in a soldier for hire. I was inspired to come up with this term after listening to a recent episode of the In Moscow's Shadows podcast by Mark Galeotti. He used another term, covert federalism, to refer to a somewhat similar phenomenon, but one I want to stress has absolutely nothing to do with Russian disintegration. I'll explain more about Mr. Galeotti's thoughts at the end of this video. Now, I want to explain what I mean by the term mercenary federalism, but before we do that, we need to explore another term, gerontocracy. Gerontocracy literally means rule by old people, and it describes a situation in which the ruling elite in a country becomes significantly older than the general population. This doesn't tend to happen in most democracies, recent history in the United States being a definite exception to this, but it does tend to happen a lot in dictatorships. That's because once they're in power, dictators tend to want to stay in power. And one reason that they want to stay in power is that stepping down as a dictator can be quite dangerous, not just to you, but to your family and your inner circle. For example, in Cameroon in 1982, President Amadou Ahidjo stepped down as dictator in favor of his trusted prime minister, Paul Biya. 2 years later, though, Biya accused Ahidjo of treason and sentenced him to death. Ahidjo survived, but only because he had the foresight to escape Senegal before Biya turned on him. Unsurprisingly, Paul Biya has never agreed to step down in favor of any successor, and he is currently the oldest serving head of state anywhere in the world at 91 years old. Now that's gerontocracy. Vladimir Putin, now 72, will be 77 when he completes his current presidential term. That's relatively old for a world leader, but that's really old for a Russian leader. In fact, in 2028, Putin will become the oldest Russian leader in history when he passes the current record holder, Leonid Brezhnev, who shuffled off this mortal coil at the tender age of 75. Actually, Brezhnev is really important for considering the impact of gerontocracy on Russia. His rule was considered to be one of stagnation, and the stagnation grew worse and worse as he and his inner circle grew older and older. But gerontocracy doesn't just breed stagnation. It also produces a layer of slightly younger people, one rung down on the ladder of power, who get stuck. The jobs they want on the next rung of power are blocked by a bunch of old people who won't or can't retire. And if the people in this younger generation are ambitious, they get frustrated. And if you keep a bunch of highly ambitious people frustrated for long enough, unexpected things can happen. After Brezhnev's death in 1982, the gerontocracy continued, and he was followed by two more old guys, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, who both died fairly quickly. And then, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev took power at the sprightly age of 54. What happens next you probably know about, and we don't have time to go through all of the late 80s and early 90s here. But what is key is that even though Gorbachev came from a younger generation, by the time he ascended to power, the Soviet Union was gripped by mercenary federalism. Let's explore exactly what I mean by this. Throughout its history, Russia has tended to be ruled by an extremely powerful individual who administers an extremely centralized state. And this is done from a complex of buildings located in central Moscow called the Kremlin. This structure persisted throughout the 20th century, despite the fact that the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation have presented themselves as decentralized federal states, with lots of autonomous regions which, in theory, can make decisions for themselves. These have almost always just been pretenses. The autonomy has rarely been real. The only times when regional autonomy, i.e. federalism, has been real has been when the central power of the Kremlin has been weakened. Specifically, during the lead-up to and immediately following the two previous Russian disintegrations. So when I'm using this term I've coined, mercenary federalism, I'm referring to what happens when those ambitious people stuck on the second rung of power, say running one of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, start expressing their frustration by amassing more and more power for their current office. This is possible because as a gerontocracy ages, the people at the top become less and less interested in how the country is run and more interested in just making sure that they get to run it. For the ambitious second-rung leadership class, this means they can't push the old guys out of power, but what they can do is acquire more power for themselves without the guys at the top either noticing or caring. In complex bureaucracies like the Soviet Union had or the Russian Federation has now, there are always a million ways for clever people to rig the system in their favor so that they can acquire more power, as long as the guys at the top don't notice and try and stop you. Another important feature of the mercenary federalism of the late Soviet period is that over time it grew more and more public. And also it gained its own momentum, and it became much harder for the Kremlin to try and control. The best example of this was, in my opinion, the rise of Boris Yeltsin. You may know Yeltsin as the grandfatherly reformer who led Russia out of the collapsing Soviet Union. That's how he presented himself to the world. In reality, Yeltsin was a man who wanted power, and he was courageous enough, and possibly frustrated enough, to bring down his country to get it. In May 1990, Yeltsin was elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet of Russia, a position which historically has always been pretty meaningless. The Supreme Soviet of Russia, just like every other Supreme Soviet in the Soviet Union, had always just been a rubber-stamp parliament that did whatever the Kremlin ordered it to do. But Yeltsin changed this. By 1990, some smaller republics in the Soviet Union were well on their way to becoming much more powerful. Mercenary federalism was in full bloom and out in the open. Estonia, for example, had declared itself sovereign in 1988, and that its laws were superior to the laws of the Soviet Union. Latvia and Lithuania did the same thing the next year, and then so many other bits of the Soviet Union started declaring themselves sovereign, the era became known as the Parade of Sovereignties. So when he took office as the nominal leader of what was then called the Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic, Yeltsin had a ready-made template to start making similar moves, and amass more power for himself in the process. There's no doubting that Yeltsin was a talented politician, a real man of the people. He was the sort of politician that you could have a beer with, and since he was a raging alcoholic, he might have 4 or 5 beers with you. He traveled the country and stood among the people and promised them a better life. And if they would support him, he promised to give their bit of Russia more local autonomy. In August 1990, in Ufa, the capital of Russia's Bashkir region, he famously said, "Take as much autonomy as you can swallow." This promise of more autonomy was an outright lie, or at best, you could say that Yeltsin reneged on his promise to the Bashkir people and other minority groups in coming years. More on this later. Russia did very much want to swallow more autonomy for Russia as part of the Soviet Union, though. The more powerful the Russian Republic became, the more powerful Yeltsin himself became. But just increasing regional autonomy could only get him so far. Then, in August 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the entire Soviet Union, was overthrown in a coup. This was the opportunity that Yeltsin had been waiting for. He could now get off the second rung. Yeltsin fought back against the coup plotters, not by encouraging loyalty to Gorbachev, the national leader, but by urging the military in Moscow to be loyal to the Russian Republic that he controlled. Crowds gathered around the Russian Parliament building, known as the Russian White House, and on the same day the coup was announced, he stood on a tank and addressed the crowd waving a flag. Not the national flag of the Soviet Union, but the new flag of the Russian Republic. As Yeltsin's support swelled, the coup began to falter, and in a few days it was all over and Gorbachev was back in office. Except the central authority of the Kremlin, which had been ailing for a while, was now mortally wounded. Or to use a more formal term, the Soviet Union experienced central authority collapse. No one seemed to care much what Gorbachev thought or did. He was a spent force. Instead, all eyes were turning to the leaders of the 15 republics, especially the leader of the Russian Republic. During the Soviet era, the Russian Republic played a very unique role. It was by far the biggest of the 15 republics, both in terms of geography and population. And geographically speaking, it was the glue which held the rest of the country together. So when the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in December 1991 to announce they were leaving the Soviet Union, that effectively ended the Soviet Union, and all 15 of the republics, even Turkmenistan, which didn't really want it, were suddenly independent countries. So let's recap for a moment. The gerontocracy of the Brezhnev era led to mercenary federalism, which culminated in the parade of sovereignties, which, after a central authority collapse, made the breakup of the Soviet Union inevitable. And while it's important to note that some republics saw independence as an expression of national identity, most notably the Baltic republics, Russia became independent because Boris Yeltsin wanted power. The Russian nationalism, which we know and love today, just wasn't really a factor. His move to lead Russia to independence was just a way for him to leapfrog Gorbachev and take control of the Kremlin for himself. He didn't become ruler of the entire Soviet Union, but he still became an extremely powerful head of state in a country that was still regarded as a superpower. So that's pretty good. And we know that Yeltsin's primary objective was always power, not democracy or the regional autonomy that he promised the Bashkir people. Because in 1993, when the Russian Duma tried to curtail some of Yeltsin's growing power, he ordered tanks to surround the Russian White House and shell the Russian White House until they gave up. So basically, Yeltsin stood on a tank outside the Russian White House in order to take power, and then he ordered tanks to attack the Russian White House to consolidate power. In 1996, Yeltsin suffered a series of quite serious heart attacks, and he disappeared from public view for months at a time. But he never considered stepping down. He was too afraid of what a successor might do to him, his inner circle, and his family, many of whom had become quite mysteriously wealthy since Yeltsin had come to office. After a long search to find a successor he could trust to protect him and his family, he finally settled on Vladimir Putin. So yes, Putin is in power today, not because he was considered to be a talented leader or a talented administrator of government systems, but basically because he promised not to kill his boss. And now, 25 years on, Putin is still in power, and the gerontocracy of the Brezhnev era is back, and better than ever, baby. Not all of Putin's long-term cronies actually want to stay in office, it turns out. Sergei Lavrov, Russia's 73-year-old foreign minister, has reportedly asked at least once for permission to retire so he can spend more time with his family and his mistress's family. But reportedly, Putin has said no. Why exactly Putin has said no is not clear, but it makes sense that he wants to remain surrounded by people that he trusts and people who he's trusted for a long time, rather than bring new people who he doesn't trust as much into these key roles. And there are many other septuagenarians in top jobs who likewise may not be allowed to retire. These include Nikolai Patrushev, Secretary of the Security Council, Sergei Naryshkin, Director of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Viktor Zolotov, Director of the National Guard, and Alexander Bortnikov, Director of the Federal Security Service, the very powerful FSB. And if you're an ambitious person in Russia right now, sitting one rung down from the top rung of power, you've been probably waiting for your day in the sun for a very long time. And as the backlog of other frustrated officials grows, you're probably thinking your day in the sun may never come. Maybe it's just best to make the most of what you have now. Here's a recap. Russia is in the grips of some pretty serious gerontocracy, and the longer Putin stays in power, the worse that gerontocracy will get. We know that in the past, gerontocracy has fostered mercenary federalism, which, left unaddressed, ultimately undermines the power of the Kremlin. We know that a crisis in the Kremlin's authority could be coming. Historically, these have come because of a combination of military defeats and economic shocks. I'm not going to get into whether or not Russia can win its war in Ukraine right now. That's too big of a side quest to cover in this video. But I think it's undeniable that in terms of casualties and economic stability, this war is costing Russia dearly. Add these ingredients together, and you have a cocktail that is pretty similar to the one which was served up right before the two previous Russian disintegrations. On that basis, then, you'd have to say that a third disintegration is at least plausible, if not probable. However, as I mentioned at the start, there are some pretty serious differences between 2025 and 1991. And these certainly make the narrative of a third Russian disintegration much more complicated, and may even prevent them altogether. Let's go through them. The most obvious difference is one of political geography. Yes, just like the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation contains 21 individual republics, but these only make up relatively small parts of the country, and they are spread around. Most of them, if they sought independence, would be enclaves and not geographically viable countries. Most Russians live in oblasts or krais, which are just provinces, and many of these tend to be relatively small in size. When the Soviet Union's central authority collapsed in 1991, it was easy for the Soviet republics, with their relatively neatly drawn borders, to step into the vacuum. That wouldn't be the case in 2025. The 21 republics exist, at least on paper, to cater to Russia's indigenous populations. Bashkortostan, for example, is the republic of the Bashkir people that I mentioned earlier. In most republics, the titular nationalities, as they're called, actually make up a minority of the current population. In Bashkortostan, for example, the Bashkirs only make up about a third of the people that live there. Also, Putin's regime and the rest of Russia has been terrified of another Russian disintegration for decades now. And as it has gradually stripped away the autonomy these republics briefly enjoyed at the start of Yeltsin's regime, Putin has appointed a series of yes men to rule them, men who will obey his orders unquestioningly, and, it is hoped, not have the ambition or inclination to acquire significant power for themselves. Let's stick with Bashkortostan to explore this. Putin appointed Radi Kabirov to be the new head of Bashkortostan in 2018. He's been a loyal servant of Putin ever since. For example, in 2020, a chemical company controlled by Moscow-based oligarchs wanted to destroy Mount Kushtau, one of a series of mountains the Bashkir people consider sacred. They proposed grinding the mountain up to produce soda ash, used to make baking soda, among other things. A massive civil disobedience campaign erupted and successfully stopped the mine. Putin was furious and ordered Kabirov to crush the movement which had been responsible for the protest, and he's gone to ridiculous lengths to obey this command. The organization had been founded to protect Bashkir language, Bashkir culture, and the local environment. But Kabirov has labeled it a terrorist organization and has relentlessly pursued its leaders. Today, most are in prison on trumped-up charges or in exile. Looking at the current state of play, I gotta admit, Bashkortostan seems like an unlikely candidate for mercenary federalism. It seems unlikely a complete toady like Kabirov would ever seek more autonomy for Bashkortostan, let alone lead Bashkortostan to independence. And it seems unlikely that the large Russian-speaking population in Bashkortostan would ever embrace the national determination of the Bashkir people. Also, an independent Bashkortostan would be an enclave and probably not viable geographically. So with these factors in place, it seems very unlikely that Radi Kabirov in Bashkortostan or any other Russian regional leader in a similar situation would ever really engage in anything like mercenary federalism, let alone kick off a third Russian disintegration. It's just not going to happen, is it? Or is it? Let's review these things that seem like obstacles in a bit more detail. Yes, Radi Kabirov, like most heads of most republics, is a Putin stooge, but he also has no moral compass. For example, in late 2023, he arrested a crane operator from rural Bashkortostan who had no history of political activism whatsoever and charged him with terrorism. That man, Rustam Faradidnov, was held in pretrial detention for a year and then tried and sentenced to 5 years in prison on no evidence at all. Kabirov did this to him because Faradidnov's brother, Ruslan Gabasov, was one of those leaders from that environmental protest in 2020 I mentioned earlier. Now in exile, Gabasov has been told that his brother will only be released when Gabasov comes back to Russia, back to Bashkortostan, to face charges. I spoke to Ruslan in a video interview not long after his brother's arrest. If you have time after watching this video, I would really appreciate it if you give that one a watch. I think the more people that know about Rustam's situation, the better. So Vladimir Kabirov takes innocent people and turns them into hostages. Meanwhile, he has his own family living abroad, in luxury, safely outside Putin's grasp. That's not exactly a sign of mutual trust, is it? Yes, Kabirov has his current office because Putin appointed him, but I don't think he's likely to ever make it to national leadership. His career has hit a dead end. The only way that he can get richer and more powerful, two things he seems to be very interested in, is to increase the power of his current office. Kabirov is loyal to Putin now, but as Putin ages and becomes weaker, will he remain loyal? He might start looking for a new patron, or he might set himself up as his new patron. And I would suspect there are dozens of other Kabirov-style yes-men scattered across Russia who are ready to turn on Putin at the first sign of critical weakness. Regarding the ethnic makeup of the republics and the other Russian regions, yes, that would be a factor in any coming Russian disintegration, but it's important to remember this wasn't the main factor in what happened in 1991. Ethnic self-determination was a factor in the Baltic republics. There can be no doubt about that. But it was the decision of the bigger republics to leave the Soviet Union, most notably Russia, that was actually decisive. And nationalism was a fairly insignificant part of Russia's independence movement. In fact, from many of the post-Soviet states, independence came first, and then nationalism was added in afterwards to bind the people together. Also, the ethnic makeup of the republics is a more complicated issue than it looks. Yes, the Bashkirs make up roughly a third of Bashkortostan's population, but another 25% is made up of Tatars, who speak a very similar language. And many of the people who are classified as Russians today are actually descendants of Bashkir and Tatar speakers who moved to urban areas and started speaking Russian. That's a process which is called Russification, and which has been an official policy of various Russian regimes for centuries now. Personally, I don't think Bashkortostan's ethnic makeup would be a factor at all in whether Vladimir Kabirov decided to engage in mercenary federalism. And even if it did become an issue, it's not one that is as clear-cut as the census figures might indicate. Lastly, there are those internal Russian borders, which look more like crazy paving than something that a cartographer might have drawn up. Is this a significant barrier to Russian disintegration? Yes, I don't think there's any denying that. Even though the old Soviet republics were not particularly important institutions in the Soviet Union, the fact that their borders were relatively neatly drawn just made the breakup of the Soviet Union much quicker and much more peaceful than it otherwise could have been. And it's important to note that it was much less peaceful in the places where the borders were more convoluted, like between Azerbaijan and Armenia. However, there are historical precedents for bits of Russia to unilaterally redraw their borders when their leaders are pursuing mercenary federalism. One example is the Ural Republic, which was a 1993 attempt by 5 Russian oblasts to band together to form a new Russian republic. In the Russian Federation at the time, when the Kremlin was still reconsolidating its centralized power, this would have given the region more autonomy. After months of planning, the constitution of the new republic came into force on the 31st of October, 1993. And at first, President Yeltsin seemed to welcome the initiative the local leaders of these oblasts had shown, before 9 days later, crushing the self-declared republic's government like a bug. I bring this up not to suggest that there might be an independent Ural Republic someday, but just to show that Russia's internal boundaries have not always been an effective barrier to curtailing the ambitions of Russia's regional leaders in the past. One other geographical difference is there's no equivalent to the Soviet Union's Russia in the current Russian Federation. What I mean is, there's no one political entity which is central to the existence of the Russian Federation the way Russia was to the USSR. I'm sure there are people out there championing the cause of Muscovy or whatever the Russian rump state might be called, but to me this seems a bit fanciful, and crucially, there's no Muscovy in the current political makeup of the Russian Federation. But there is an independence movement which, if it was successful, would certainly put the ongoing existence of the Russian Federation into some doubt. Ingria. Ingria is the independence movement of St. Petersburg and the surrounding area known as Leningrad Oblast. It takes its name from the Ingrian people who don't really exist anymore, so really this is a regionalist movement for the St. Petersburg area, not a national ethnic one. Personally, I've always found the idea that St. Petersburg might become independent as a bit outlandish. Yes, there's a St. Petersburg-Moscow rivalry, but independence for Russia's second city? However, I did once briefly get the chance to meet one of the main advocates for Ingrian independence, an exiled Russian lawyer named Pavel Ivlev. And when I say meet, what I mean is I sidled up to him at an event we were both attending, and I asked him if I could interview him, and he said no. So yeah, but we did have a brief conversation after that. He gave me his card and he was polite. Anyway, Ivlev was a major player in the Yukos affair, which was when, in the early 2000s, Putin's regime seized Yukos, a private company that then produced 20% of Russia's oil output. Its CEO, oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, was arrested and imprisoned. Ivlev was Yukos' lawyer, and he fled the country, refusing to give false evidence about his client, at great risk to himself and to his family. I don't really know the man, I can't speak for him, but it's my impression that he's a serious person. I don't think he's going to events representing Ingrian independence because he has nothing better to do. And that's all I can really say about this. But yes, it's obvious that a third Russian disintegration cannot happen the same way the second one did in 1991. The situations are just too different. However, in some crucial ways, it's possible that some of the main ingredients from those events are starting to emerge again. So we ought to be watchful. There's no visible sign of mercenary federalism yet. I just want to be clear on that. But could it happen? I think we should be on the lookout for it. I don't think the current situation in Chechnya counts as this. I think that's a different situation. So we need to be on the lookout for this happening in other republics. I would also say we should be discussing the possibility of a third Russian disintegration more openly. Not because I think talking about it is going to make that happen. I don't think that's the way the universe works. Also, I'm not saying I want this to happen. It's just something I think could happen. If it does happen, it will be a very uncertain and possibly dangerous moment. And I think it will be more uncertain and possibly more dangerous if it takes us by surprise. I want to end with a couple notes. First of all, the scenario I've outlined for a third Russian disintegration is just one of many possible ways it could happen. It's just one that seems fairly straightforward to me at the moment. I will admit it's a pretty bleak scenario. Here's another scenario. Exiled national leaders from Russia's various ethnic minorities have set up their own governments in exile all around the world. Some of them are working together in a group called the League of Free Nations with the goal of achieving self-determination for Russia's republics. How this transition could happen exactly is hard for me to envision. That could change. But I have to admit, the idea of Radi Kabirov being replaced by a democratically elected leader is a much more appealing prospect, and something I hope to make a video about in the future. Also, in the episode of the In Moscow's Shadows podcast that inspired my thinking for this video, Mark Galeotti used the term covert federalism. And by this, he meant something different from what I've been talking about here. Galeotti was also comparing a problem from the Brezhnev era to one that he thinks might emerge under Putin, but he was talking about a broader loss of social mobility that would impact a wide range of government officials in various regional offices, not just the leaders of Russia's regions. And he was certainly not describing covert federalism as something that could lead to Russian disintegration. Galeotti tends to pour cold water on this sort of speculation. So while it was his podcast which inspired my thinking, and I do highly recommend his podcast, the ideas which I've expressed in this video are entirely my fault, not his. Thanks for watching, especially if you are still watching. I'll be making more videos about this and similar subjects in the future. I've also got the Fredo Rockwell podcast coming out soon, and The Future of Russia, is a topic which has come up in several of the episodes I've recorded so far. So be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss those when they come out. And I'll see you guys in the next video.